I never expected that a leaky pipe would change my life. But that's exactly what happened when water started dripping from my ceiling and forced me to meet the man living upstairs. It's funny how the biggest shifts in your personal universe can start with something so mundane, so utterly inconvenient. One minute you're living your life, a quiet, predictable series of days strung together like beads on a string, and the next, a single drop of water falls and shatters the whole thing. But sometimes, when things shatter, they create an opening for something new to come through. Let me take you back. My name is Miles, and at the time, I was 27. My life was my work, and my work was my life. As a freelance illustrator, my apartment wasn't just my home. It was my studio, my office, and my entire world, really. I had a routine that felt safe. I'd wake up, make coffee, sit at my drawing table by the large window overlooking the street, and lose myself in commissions for children's books and indie graphic novels. The world outside the window felt like a movie I was watching, distant and separate from my own reality. I had friends, of course, but my day-to-day existence was a solitary one, curated to minimize friction and unexpected variables. I liked it that way, or at least, I had convinced myself that I did. My apartment was on the third floor of a pre-war building with charming, if occasionally faulty, character. The floors creaked, the radiator hissed like a serpent in winter, and the plumbing was a mystery best left undisturbed. My life was contained within those four walls, a carefully controlled environment of pencils, ink, and digital palettes. It was quiet, it was orderly, and it was lonely, though I rarely used that word. I preferred self-sufficient. It sounded stronger, more intentional. Then he moved in. The apartment directly above mine had been empty for a few months, a silent space that I'd grown accustomed to. The sudden eruption of noise, the thud of heavy boxes, the scraping of furniture, the muffled sound of voices, was a disruption to my peaceful solitude. For a few days, I found myself annoyed, my concentration broken by the sounds of a life assembling itself over my head. I'd sigh, adjust my headphones, and try to recapture my focus. I first saw him on a Saturday morning. I was heading out to grab groceries, and he was coming down the stairs, carrying an empty, collapsed cardboard box. He was a lot. That was my first impression. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark, unruly hair that fell over his forehead. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt that clung to his frame in a way that seemed both effortless and entirely deliberate, and his jeans were faded and smudged with what looked like paint or wood stain. He moved with an easy confidence, a physical certainty that I, in my life of quiet contemplation and precise hand movements, had never known. He glanced up and saw me, and a smile immediately spread across his face. It was a genuine, disarming smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Hey," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the narrow stairwell. "Sorry about all the noise. I'm Caleb. Just moved in upstairs, for B." He shifted the box under one arm and extended a hand. His hand was large and calloused, a working man's hand. I took it, and my own felt small and soft in his grip. "Miles," I managed to say. "3B. Welcome to the building." "Thanks," he said, his smile lingering. "Hopefully the chaos dies down soon. Just trying to make the place livable." He gave a slight nod and continued down the stairs, leaving me standing there with the faint impression of his grip still on my palm. My first thought was simple and immediate. He was beautiful. My second thought, which followed like a corrective shadow, was equally simple. He was completely, utterly, and devastatingly out of my league. And, I assumed, not even playing in the same ballpark. That's just how it goes, right? You see someone who looks like they were carved from a different, more perfect stone, and you file them away in a mental folder labeled unattainable, and get on with your day. So that's what I did. I got my groceries, went back to my apartment, and tried to forget the way his eyes had crinkled when he smiled. The next few weeks fell into a new kind of routine. I learned the patterns of his life through the sounds that filtered through my ceiling. The heavy tread of his boots in the morning, the slam of the front door, the silence during the day, and his return in the evening. Sometimes I'd hear the low thrum of music or the indistinct murmur of a television. These sounds became the new soundtrack to my life, a constant, low-level reminder of the man living above me. We'd cross paths in the hallway or on the stairs, exchanging pleasantries. "Hey, Miles," "Hey, Caleb," It was always friendly, always brief. Each time, I felt that same little jolt, that quiet awareness of his presence, and each time, I'd push it down, reminding myself of the folder he belonged in. He was just a handsome neighbor, nothing more. And then came the drip. It started on a Tuesday afternoon. A soft, rhythmic plink, plink, plink. I ignored it at first, assuming it was a sound from outside. But it was persistent. I finally muted my own music and tilted my head, listening. It was coming from the corner of my living room, near the wall that bordered my small workspace. I looked up. There, on the pristine white ceiling, was a small, brownish watermark, slowly expanding like a bloom in time-lapse. And from its center, a single drop of water gathered, swelled, and fell, hitting the hardwood floor with that maddeningly gentle sound. My heart sank. The plumbing. The one thing you hope you'll never have to deal with in an old building. After placing a bucket to catch the water, I knew what I had to do. I had to go upstairs. I had to go talk to Caleb. I stood outside his door for a full minute, my stomach twisting with a ridiculous nervousness that was entirely out of proportion to the situation. It was just a leak. I was just a neighbor. But the thought of having a real, extended conversation with him, one born of necessity and not just passing politeness, made me feel strangely exposed. Finally, I took a breath and knocked. I heard footsteps, the sound of a deadbolt turning, and the door swung open. Caleb stood there, wiping his hands on a towel. He was shirtless, wearing only a pair of sweatpants slung low on his hips. My brain momentarily short-circuited. His chest and stomach were lean and defined, dusted with a fine trail of dark hair. A half-finished tattoo of what looked like a winding vine crept over his shoulder and onto his bicep. I think I stared for a solid 3 seconds before I remembered how to use my mouth. Hey. I started, forcing my eyes up to his face. Sorry to bother you. I'm Miles from downstairs. His brow furrowed in concern. Yeah, of course. What's up? Is everything okay? He leaned against the doorframe, and I tried very hard not to notice the way his muscles shifted. There's, a bit of a leak, I said, gesturing vaguely toward my own apartment below. Water is, dripping from my ceiling. I think it might be coming from your place. Instantly, his expression shifted from casual concern to genuine alarm. Oh man, seriously? I am so sorry. He tossed the towel onto a nearby chair and ran a hand through his hair. Damn it. I was just doing dishes. Must be the kitchen sink. He looked at me, his eyes wide with apology. Can I come see the damage? I just nodded, my voice having temporarily abandoned me. He slipped on a pair of flip-flops and followed me down the single flight of stairs, his bare feet making soft padding sounds behind me. The whole situation felt surreal. The handsome, half-naked man from my daydreams was now following me into my apartment to inspect water damage. Life is weird. I led him into the living room and pointed at the bucket, which was now collecting a steady rhythm of drips. Caleb let out a low whistle. Wow, that's not just a little drip. Okay, let me go turn off the main valve for my line. He was all business now, his earlier casual demeanor replaced by a focused energy. He was back in a flash, this time with a t-shirt on, much to the relief of my overstimulated brain. He knelt down, examining the floorboards, then stared up at the ceiling, a frown creasing his forehead. This is my fault. I'm so sorry, Miles. I'll call the building manager right now. He was true to his word. Within the hour, Mr. Henderson, our portly and perpetually weary landlord, had been and gone, promising to have a plumber come first thing in the morning. The diagnosis was a cracked pipe under Caleb's sink, a common ailment in the building. The solution, however, was less simple. The plumber would have to open up the wall in Caleb's kitchen and likely a portion of my ceiling to check for mold and structural damage. It was going to be a messy, multi-day affair. As the reality of the situation sank in, I felt a wave of exhaustion. My sanctuary, my controlled and quiet workspace, was about to be invaded by noise, dust, and strangers. I must have looked as defeated as I felt, because Caleb's expression softened. Hey, he said gently. Don't worry. We'll figure this out. He looked around at my setup, the drawing table, the shelves of art books, the portfolios leaning against the wall. This is your studio, isn't it? I nodded mutely. Look, he said, his tone decisive. They're going to make a huge mess. We need to move all this stuff before they get here. Before I could protest or insist that I could handle it myself, He was already taking charge. "Where's the driest part of the apartment?" he asked, scanning the room. We decided on the far corner of my bedroom. And just like that, the two of us were a team. For the next 2 hours, we carefully moved my entire creative life. He was incredibly gentle with my things, lifting my heavy drawing table as if it weighed nothing, but placing it down with a surgeon's care. He handled my portfolios of original artwork with a reverence that surprised me, asking me questions about my style and the stories behind the pieces. I found myself opening up, explaining the premise of the fantasy book I was currently illustrating, talking about the frustrations and joys of my work. He listened. He didn't just hear the words. He actually listened, asking follow-up questions, his eyes fixed on mine. I learned that he was a custom furniture maker. He worked out of a shared workshop space across town. It made sense. The calloused hands, the faint scent of sawdust that I now realized always clung to him. The way he moved with such physical competence. As we worked, the awkwardness I'd always felt around him began to melt away, replaced by an easy camaraderie. We fell into a rhythm, a silent dance of lifting, carrying, and placing. The barrier between us, the one I had so carefully constructed in my mind, was being dismantled, piece by piece, box by box. At one point, we both reached for the same stack of reference books. His hand covered mine, his fingers warm and firm against my own. The contact lasted only a second, but it sent a jolt straight through me, sharp and bright. He pulled his hand back quickly, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Sorry," he mumbled, looking away. "My bad." I just shook my head, unable to speak, my heart hammering against my ribs. When we were finally done, my workspace was crammed into my bedroom, and the living room looked bare and sad, except for the bucket still collecting water. We were both sweaty and tired. "I owe you big time," I said, finally finding my voice. "You didn't have to do all that," he just shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "It was my leak. Least I could do." He glanced toward the door, and for a second, I thought he was about to leave. A strange pang of disappointment hit me. I didn't want him to go. "I was about to order a pizza," I said, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess them. "As a thank you." "If you want," his smile widened. I would never say no to pizza, and so he stayed. We sat on the floor of my dismantled living room, sharing a large pepperoni pizza straight from the box. The initial emergency had passed, and something else was settling in its place. A connection. We talked for hours. He told me about his passion for woodworking, how he loved taking a raw piece of maple or oak and finding the shape hidden inside it. He showed me photos on his phone of a rocking chair he'd just finished, its lines elegant and impossibly smooth. The pride in his voice was so clear, so infectious. I, in turn, showed him my sketchbook, something I rarely did. I flipped through pages of character studies, rough landscapes, and idle doodles. He didn't just glance at them. He studied them, his finger tracing the line of a character's cloak, his expression thoughtful. "You're really talented, Miles," he said, his voice soft. You can see so much personality in just a few lines, coming from him. The compliment landed differently. It felt solid, real. It wasn't just a polite comment. It was a statement of fact from one creator to another. In that moment, sitting on the floor surrounded by cardboard and the smell of grease, he stopped being just the unattainable handsome neighbor. He became Caleb, a person with passions and skills, someone who understood the drive to create something beautiful with your own two hands. A small, quiet part of me, the part one usually kept locked away, began to whisper with a dangerous, unfamiliar word: hope. I saw a hint of something in him that wasn't just confidence, but a deep, artistic sensitivity, a vulnerability. And it was that glimpse, more than anything else, that made him feel suddenly, terrifyingly real. And maybe, just maybe, not so unattainable after all. The next morning, the plumbers arrived. My apartment became a chaotic whirlwind of noise and activity. They tore out a section of my ceiling, exposing pipes and wires, and the fine white dust of drywall settled on everything. The work in Caleb's apartment was even more extensive. For 3 days, our little corner of the building was a construction zone. My ability to work was shot, so I spent most of my time in coffee shops, trying to sketch and feel some semblance of normalcy. Caleb and I communicated mostly through texts. He'd send updates, usually accompanied by a self-deprecating comment about the state of his kitchen. They found the leak. My wall now looks like a giant bit a chunk out of it. I'd reply with a picture of my own dusty, chaotic living room. Twins, it was a simple, easy back and forth that kept the connection from the pizza night alive, a thin thread stretching through the chaos. He always made sure to check in, asking if I needed anything, if the noise was too much. His thoughtfulness was a constant, pleasant surprise. On the third day, the work was finally done. The plumbers left, the walls were patched, though not yet painted, and a blessed silence descended on the building. I spent the evening cleaning up the last of the dust, trying to restore order to my space. I felt a strange mix of relief and something else. Disappointment? The crisis had created a reason for Caleb and me to be in each other's lives. Now that it was over, I wondered if we would just revert to being hallway acquaintances. The thought left a hollow feeling in my chest. Just as I was finishing up, there was a soft knock on my door. It was Caleb. He was holding a six-pack of beer in one hand. "Peace offering," he said with a wry grin. "For the days of noise and dust," I smiled, feeling a rush of warmth. "You don't have to do that. It wasn't your fault." He stepped inside, placing the beer on my kitchen counter. Still, seemed like the neighborly thing to do. He looked around at my now clean living room, where I had yet to move my workspace back into place. "Looks much better in here, feels better," I admitted. We ended up sharing a beer, leaning against my kitchen counter. The easy vibe from pizza night returned almost immediately. We talked about our days, about work, about nothing in particular. And then, the conversation took a turn. "So," he said, looking down at the beer bottle in his hands. "Got a little careless at the workshop today." He turned his left hand over. There was a crude, bulky bandage wrapped around his palm and the base of his thumb, with a small spot of red already soaking through. "Caleb, what happened?" I asked, my voice sharp with concern. He gave a weak, slightly embarrassed laugh. Wood chisel slipped. "It's not as bad as it looks, I promise. Just a deep gash. The problem is, I'm terrible at this." He gestured with his injured hand. "I can build a dining table from scratch, but I can't wrap my own hand without it looking like a mummy's." I looked at the clumsy wrapping and then back at his face. "You need to clean that and bandage it properly, or it'll get infected," I said, my practical side taking over. "Come on." I led him to my bathroom, my mind surprisingly clear and focused. This was a problem I could solve. I had him sit on the closed lid of the toilet while I pulled out my first aid kit. I was always meticulous about keeping it stocked, a hazard of working with sharp pencils and craft knives, I suppose. "Okay," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "This might sting a little." I gently began to unwrap the bandage he'd put on. He hissed in sympathy for himself. I know. I'm a baby." "You're not a baby," I said quietly, focusing on the task. Once the old bandage was off, I saw the cut. It was clean but deep, still weeping a little. I took a sterile wipe and began to clean around the edges of the wound. He flinched slightly but held perfectly still, his eyes fixed on my face. The bathroom felt incredibly small, the air thick with a sudden, charged intimacy. I was acutely aware of everything. The faint scent of his soap, the warmth radiating from his body, the sound of his quiet, steady breathing. My own heart was doing a frantic tap dance against my ribs. I worked in silence, my movements careful and precise. I applied antiseptic cream with a cotton swab, my fingers brushing against his skin. His hand was so warm, his palm rough with calluses even as the skin on the back was smooth. I could feel the thrum of his pulse beneath my fingertips, a steady, life-affirming beat. I was so focused, so close to him, that the rest of the world seemed to fall away. It was just us, in the small, white-tiled room, under the hum of the vanity light. When the cut was clean, I took out a fresh gauze pad and roll of medical tape. "All right, almost done," I whispered. I pressed the gauze against the wound, and he let out a small, sharp breath. I looked up and my eyes met his. He wasn't looking at his hand. He was looking at me. His gaze was intense, searching. It was the same look I'd seen for a split second in the hallway, but now it was sustained, unambiguous. There was no apology in it, no uncertainty. It was just there, a silent question hanging in the air between us. My breath hitched. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. I quickly looked back down, my fingers fumbling with the tape. I wrapped his hand carefully, my movements feeling slow and clumsy now. Every brush of my skin against his felt like a tiny electric shock. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy with unspoken things. When I was finished, my work was neat and professional. A perfect white bandage against his tan skin. "There," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "That should hold." He didn't pull his hand away. He just kept it there, resting in mine. He slowly flexed his fingers, testing the bandage. "Thank you, Miles," he said, his voice low and husky. He finally looked down at his hand, then back up at me. "You're good at that. Taking care of things." I couldn't think of a single thing to say. I just nodded, my throat tight. We stayed like that for a long moment, me standing, him sitting, our hands still loosely connected. It felt like a turning point. A line had been crossed. We were no longer just neighbors who'd been through a plumbing disaster together. Something new and fragile and terrifyingly hopeful had been established in the quiet intimacy of my bathroom. The air was buzzing with it, and I had no idea what to do next. He finally, slowly, withdrew his hand. The loss of contact was immediate and stark, leaving my own fingers feeling cold. He stood up, and the small space of the bathroom suddenly felt even smaller. "Well," he said, his voice still a little rough, "I should probably let you get your apartment back in order." He gave me a small, almost shy smile that was completely at odds with his usual confident demeanor. It was this vulnerability, this crack in his self-assured facade, that hit me the hardest. It made my heart ache with a strange, protective tenderness. I walked him to the door, the silence between us no longer comfortable, but charged with a new, unspoken tension. It was like we had both seen something we weren't supposed to see, and now we didn't know how to pretend we hadn't. At the door, he paused. "Seriously, Miles. Thanks. For everything." He met my eyes one last time, that intense look returning for a brief, heart-stopping second, and then he was gone, the soft click of my door closing behind him echoing in the quiet apartment. I leaned my back against the door and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My hands were trembling slightly. I went back to the bathroom and stared at my reflection. My face was flushed, my eyes wide. I replayed the entire scene in my head, dissecting every moment, every glance, every touch. The logical part of my brain, the part that had kept me safe in my solitary routine, was screaming at me. It was telling me I was reading too much into it. He was just grateful. It was just an act of neighborly kindness. A guy like Caleb, confident and ruggedly handsome, wouldn't be interested in someone like me, a quiet, anxious artist. It was wishful thinking, a fantasy born of loneliness. But another part of me, a braver, more hopeful part, was whispering a different story. It was replaying the look in his eyes, the way he'd held so still, the feeling of his pulse under my fingers. It was remembering the softness in his voice when he said I was good at taking care of things. This part of me insisted that what I felt in that room was real. The connection was real. The tension was mutual. I had spent so long observing the world from a distance, analyzing characters on a page, that I couldn't stop myself from analyzing this. I was caught in a loop, a battle between my fear of rejection and my desperate hope for connection. The next few days were a special kind of torture. The easy communication we'd established was gone, replaced by a palpable awkwardness. We went back to being just hallway acquaintances, but now even that felt strained. The brief "heys" were rushed, our eyes barely meeting. I saw him once by the mailboxes, and instead of stopping to chat, we both just gave a tight-lipped nod and hurried in opposite directions. It felt like we were both holding our breath, waiting for the other to make a move, or perhaps just waiting for the charge between us to dissipate. For me, it was a confirmation of my worst fears. I had imagined it all. My overactive, storyteller's imagination had spun a simple moment of gratitude into a romantic turning point. I had made him uncomfortable with my intensity, my focused care. The thought was mortifying. I felt a hot flush of shame every time I remembered it. So, I did what I always did when faced with emotional uncertainty. I retreated. I threw myself back into my work with a vengeance, moving my drawing table back to its rightful place and losing myself for hours in shading and cross-hatching. I put my headphones on, turned up the music, and tried to block out the world, including the sounds of the man living upstairs. But it was impossible. Every creak of his floorboards, every time I heard his door open or close, my head would snap up. My focus was shattered. I'd find myself staring at a blank page, the scene in the bathroom playing on a loop in my mind's eye. The warmth of his skin, the intensity of his gaze. the soft huskiness of his voice. I would trace the memory of his hand in mine, trying to decide if the electricity I'd felt had been real or just a product of my own longing. I oscillated wildly between hope and despair. One moment, I'd be convinced there was something there. He had looked at me in a way no one ever had before. The connection was undeniable. The next moment, I'd be drowning in self-doubt. I was being delusional. He was just being nice. I was the weird, quiet neighbor who had read way too much into a simple request for first aid. This internal debate was exhausting, a constant, draining hum of anxiety beneath the surface of my days. I started timing my entrances and exits from the apartment to avoid running into him. The thought of another awkward, charged encounter too much to bear. My safe, orderly world had been completely upended, and all I was left with was a profound and aching uncertainty. This period of silent, awkward tension stretched on for nearly a week. A week of overthinking, of replaying every detail, of convincing myself I had ruined a potential friendship by wanting more. I had just about resigned myself to the idea that whatever had sparked between us had been extinguished by the awkwardness that followed. I decided I had to be the one to fix it, to go back to being just a friendly neighbor, even if it felt like a consolation prize. My plan was to catch him in the hall, offer a breezy, casual hey, and pretend that the intense moment in my bathroom had never happened. But I never got the chance to enact my pathetic little plan. That Friday night, as I was cleaning up my workspace, preparing to settle in for a weekend of solitary drawing, there was a knock on my door. It was the same soft, hesitant knock as before. My heart immediately leaped into my throat. I knew it was him. For a moment, I considered not answering. I could just pretend I wasn't home. It would be easier, safer. But my feet were already moving, carrying me to the door as if on their own accord. I opened it, and there he was. Caleb. He looked nervous, genuinely nervous. His hands were stuffed into the pockets of his jacket, and he was shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He wasn't smiling his usual easy smile. His expression was serious, his brow slightly furrowed. Hey, he said, his voice quiet. Can I come in for a second? I need to talk to you about something. My mind raced through a dozen disastrous possibilities. Was he moving out? Was he here to complain about some noise I'd made? Was he here to tell me to back off, to state in no uncertain terms that I had misread the situation? I braced myself for the worst and nodded, stepping aside to let him in. Sure, I said, my voice sounding thin and reedy to my own ears. He walked into the middle of my living room and just stood there for a moment, looking around as if he'd never seen the space before. I closed the door, the sound echoing the sudden pounding in my chest. He turned to face me, pulling his hands from his pockets. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as a nervous tic. Look, he started, then stopped. He let out a breath. This is going to sound, I don't know, this is going to sound weird, but I haven't been able to get it out of my head. I just waited, my body rigid with suspense. He finally met my eyes, and the same intensity I'd seen in the bathroom was there, but this time it was mixed with a raw, startling vulnerability. Ever since the other night, he said, his voice low and earnest. When you helped me with my hand. I haven't been sleeping right. He shook his head slightly, as if he couldn't believe the words he was saying. It's stupid, but I keep having these dreams. My heart stuttered. Dreams? What kind of dreams? I managed to ask, the words barely a whisper. He looked down at the floor for a second before looking back at me, his gaze unwavering. I keep dreaming about you, he said, the confession hanging in the air between us, heavy and fragile. About that night. About sitting in your bathroom while you took care of me. And about other things. About what might have happened after. If I hadn't been such a coward and just left. I was speechless. My brain felt like it had been wiped clean. He was dreaming about me. The thought was so staggering, so far beyond what my most hopeful fantasies had dared to conjure, that I couldn't process it. He took a half-step closer, his expression pleading, as if he needed me to understand. It's driving me crazy, Miles, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This whole week, avoiding you, pretending like nothing happened, it's been hell. Because all I can think about is you. He paused, taking a deep, shaky breath, and then he delivered the line that would rearrange my entire world. I was wondering, he said, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper, if maybe We could finish one of those dreams. While we're awake, the silence that followed was absolute. It was filled with the weight of his words, with the incredible, terrifying risk he had just taken. He had laid his feelings bare, offering them to me with a vulnerability that mirrored my own deepest fears and hopes. And in that moment, all my anxiety, all my doubt, just evaporated. It was replaced by a wave of such profound relief and affection that it almost brought me to my knees. He wasn't disgusted. He wasn't uncomfortable. He felt it too. It was real. I took a step forward, closing the small gap that remained between us. "Caleb," I said, and my own voice was thick with unshed tears. I thought I had imagined everything. A look of pure relief washed over his face. "No," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You didn't imagine any of it. I've been interested for months, since the day I first saw you on the stairs. I'm not good at this. I've never felt this way about a guy before." I didn't know what to do. His own confession, that this was new territory for him, was the final piece of the puzzle. It explained his initial confidence, his subsequent hesitation, everything. He wasn't some impossibly self-assured guy. He was just as uncertain as I was, navigating something new and overwhelming. "Me neither," I admitted, a small, watery laugh escaping me. "I'm not good at this either." He reached out then, his hand gently cupping my jaw. His thumb stroked my cheek, and the touch was electric, 1,000 times more potent than when he had held my hand. "So," he said softly, his eyes searching mine, "can we be not good at this together?" I didn't answer with words. I just leaned in and pressed my lips against his. The kiss was hesitant at first, a gentle, questioning touch. It was a confirmation. "Yes, this is real. Yes, I feel it too." Then, as he deepened the kiss, all the pent-up tension and longing from the past week, from the past months, poured into it. It wasn't like a dream. It was better. It was real and solid and warm, filled with the taste of his relief and the steadying presence of his hand on my face. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, resting our foreheads against each other. The silence in the room was no longer tense or awkward. It was peaceful, filled with the quiet, humming promise of a new beginning. The weeks that followed that kiss were like waking up into a world that was suddenly in full, vibrant color after a lifetime of seeing in grayscale. The awkwardness between us vanished completely, replaced by an intimacy that felt both thrillingly new and deeply comfortable. It was as if all the unspoken tension had finally been given a language, and we couldn't stop speaking it. We were, as Caleb had suggested, not very good at it, but we were figuring it out together. Our first official date was 2 days later. He took me to his workshop, a huge, cavernous space that smelled beautifully of sawdust and varnish. He showed me the tools of his trade, the massive saws and planers, and the delicate hand tools he used for intricate carving. He spoke about wood with a poet's passion, explaining the grain of a piece of walnut, the deep red of cherry wood. Seeing him in his element, covered in a fine layer of dust, his eyes lit up with passion, I felt myself falling for him all over again. I, in turn, let him fully into my world. He'd sit on the edge of my couch while I worked at my drawing table, watching in silence as my sketches came to life. He never made me feel self-conscious. He'd just watch, completely absorbed, and when I was done, he'd look at the page and then at me with an expression of such genuine admiration it made my heart ache. He understood the quiet focus my work required, the need to lose myself in a world of my own making. He didn't just tolerate my passions, he celebrated them. We fell into a new, shared routine. Mornings often started with coffee in my apartment before he left for the workshop. Evenings ended together, either cooking a messy dinner in his recently repaired kitchen or curled up on my couch, watching old movies. The sounds from his apartment that once signified a stranger above me now became comforting signals of his presence. The tread of his boots no longer felt like an intrusion, but a welcome announcement of his return home. One Saturday, I came home to find a small, beautifully crafted wooden shelf mounted on the wall next to my desk. It was made of dark, rich walnut, sanded so smooth it felt like silk. It was a simple, elegant piece, but it was perfect. "I thought your ink bottles deserved a better home," Caleb said, coming up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. I leaned back against his chest, my hand resting on the flawless wood. It was such a small thing, a shelf, but it felt monumental. It was a piece of him, of his world, now a permanent fixture in mine. Our two lives, once so separate, were literally being joined together. We learned each other's rhythms, each other's fears and dreams. I learned that his outward confidence was a shield for a deep-seated fear of not being good enough, a remnant of a family that never understood his choice to be a craftsman instead of a businessman. He learned about my anxiety, about the quiet loneliness that had defined so much of my life, and he never once made me feel ashamed of it. Instead, he just made more space for me, showing me through his steady, unwavering presence that I didn't have to face it alone anymore. Life isn't a fairy tale. It doesn't just smooth itself out into a perfect, happy ending. But what we found was something better because it was real. It was waking up in the morning and seeing his face on the pillow next to me. It was the easy laughter that now filled my once silent apartment. It was the simple, profound comfort of holding his hand, knowing I was no longer just observing life from a distance, but was an active, vulnerable participant in it. The leak in my ceiling had long been patched and painted over, leaving no trace. But it had opened up a crack in the ceiling of my solitary world, letting in a light I never knew I was missing. Sometimes I think back to that first day I saw him on the stairs, how I'd immediately filed him away as unattainable. I think about how close I came to letting my fear and insecurity convince me that the connection I felt wasn't real. It's a humbling reminder that the biggest barriers in our lives are often the ones we build ourselves. We create our own folders, our own labels, our own reasons why something wonderful can't possibly happen to us. But every now and then, life sends a leaky pipe or a clumsy accident with a chisel to give you a chance to prove yourself wrong. All you have to do is be brave enough to answer the door. All you have to do is be willing to see if a dream can be finished while you're awake.